Hello and welcome back to my art studio. I'm Ruth and today I'm going to show you how to create this drawing. By the end of this video you'll know how to create a daisy in charcoal, and I'm going to provide all the materials that you need, and I'm also going to show you all the tips and techniques that I use so that you can do this at home. Alright, well let's get started. I love using charcoal. It's fun to use and blends and erases easily. It comes in many forms, is a great confidence builder, but it's perfect for all levels and is fantastic for learning about values. You can fill really intense blacks across large areas. It can be expressive and moody, creating atmosphere, but you can also use it in a similar way to graphite. There are lots of paper choices. Sometimes I use this grey toned paper, it's super thick, but today I'm going to be using Bristol Smooth. It has a really nice surface. For a different look, you could try watercolour paper to create a grainy effect, and there are certainly many ways to experiment with charcoal. Here are my supplies, but don't worry if you don't have all of these. I've just found them to be really helpful to create the artwork I'm about to show you. I like to use a soft fluffy makeup brush to sweep away particles and keep my fingers away from the artwork. I use a small brush to add pigment, and I find it speeds up all of the shadowing areas. And I also use a charcoal pencil, of course, and I like the Derwent Medium charcoal pencil. I like a couple of different erasers. A Tombow Mono Zero eraser is really handy to have to get into small spaces. And I sharpen this with a box cutter to get a nice chiseled edge. An H or hard pencil helps to keep your initial sketches light, and I like to use graphite powder. I show you how to use this yourself in one of my earlier videos, and I recommend it for smooth and gradual transitions. Blending stumps come in very handy for hard to reach areas, and you'll need a small sponge for when you use a charcoal block. This is thick and wide with a slanted edge and can cover large areas really fast. You'll want a sharpener, of course, and a kneaded eraser for final cleanup. I'm starting with the graphite powder to create my first petals. Dipping into the jar, I grab a little and tap it to remove excess. This protective sheet is glassine, but you can use a sheet protector or some parchment paper. It's just nice to have something see-through so that you can see your artwork underneath. I'm just painting in this pigment, and notice how little of it I'm using. A little goes a long way, and you can push it around with the brush. I like this brush. It's just a small and inexpensive filbert, but any brush will be fine. These are the blurred out of focus petals that make up the background of the artwork. It's good to have a few sheets of paper towel and wipes handy as you work. I'm grabbing my Tombow Mono Eraser. I want to show you a great little trick to reveal shapes and highlights. I work negatively to bring back out the lines within and on the edges of the petals to separate them. Using back and forth motions, I'm just going up and down with the eraser, and I'm going to be using this technique for all of the petals in the center of the flower. Honestly, once you've got the hang of this erasing instead of drawing, you'll find it a much easier method. This artwork can go fairly quickly, because if you look at the reference, you'll see that a large part of it is background, and the only real details are in the center of the flower and the petals. This is a great exercise in practicing your shadows and highlights. Artists talk about values a lot. Well, essentially, They're just what make up your lights and your darks. I sweep away the excess eraser particles with that big brush, and I find using a super soft brush helps keep the smudging to a minimum. Lots of people don't like to use charcoal because it's such a messy medium, but I think with the right approach it can be kept down to a minimum, and I use an apron and clean up as I go, and I try to keep my fingers away from the artwork whenever possible. I've sharpened my charcoal pencil now, and I'm laying in the centre of the background flower, and I'm smoothing it out with the little brush. You can always add more pigment, and I'll be adding layers to create a lot more depth as I go. Using this little brush you can really easily move the pigment around, and you don't need hardly any pigment at all, and the brush helps to keep everything really smooth. I'm looking to achieve a gradual transition so it looks out of focus just like the reference. I'm adding in my background now, beginning with the charcoal pencil to get the surrounding edges of the petals. This will be blended in to create a really soft edge later on, and I'm only covering the very outside of the petals because if I worked with the pencil to create the entire background, I'd whittle down the pencil really quickly. So I've chosen to use a block called a General's Jumbo block to quickly and easily cover my artwork. I only just discovered these at my local art store and was really happy because it made my life a whole lot easier. They come in a packet of 2B, 4B and 6B, and I think this one's a 2B, but you can see how amazingly fast this is, and I'm not applying hardly any pressure, and then I'm continuing to work around the outside of the petals just like I did before and completing the section of the background. Now I've zoomed in on the reference to show you some of the shadowing that I'm now adding in. The small brush is really handy for adding contrast and shadowing to the centre of the petals. There isn't really much shadowing, but what there is really important for creating a three-dimensional effect, and don't worry, I'll be smoothing out that background soon enough. And now comes the interesting part. I'm using my charcoal pencil to add in some of the details in the very centre. The centre of the daisy head's made up of many tiny little flowers known as disc flowers, and these radiate symmetrically from the centre and a part of the daisy head that produces seeds. Well, I'm not going to meticulously create each of these seeds from my original reference because it's really not necessary. So what I'm trying to achieve here is some semblance of texture and depth. So I'm using mostly circular shapes and adding in some darker lines and working my way over the shading I already did before. And I'm looking closely at my reference and in some ways just making up the shapes as I go along, but I'm being mindful of what I'm doing. I find it helpful to squint while I'm looking at my work, and I've sped up this part, but this is just a really small area and it's one of the only detailed areas in the entire flower. It has to make sense, so therefore take your time with it. I'm adding some more graphite powder to the whole flower head, as I know I'll be creating lighter areas later in the same way that I did before by erasing some areas to really lighten them up. Keep adding more depth with your pencil. Notice how sharp it is. I keep my sharpener with a little Tupperware box next to me so that I can sharpen as I need to. After I put in some more shadowing, I'm going to lighten up the seeds, and I'm using that Tombow Mono Eraser to do this. This eraser is perfect for creating some dimension as well as highlights, and I'm just dotting the eraser in tiny weeny circles, and it lifts the pigment right up and shows the seeds and highlights them better. This was the most fun that I had with the daisy. I know I can always add and I can always erase. I'm keeping my pressure light and I keep looking at my reference. I know I say that a lot in my videos, but it is really important. And I'm also aware of the light source when I'm doing those highlights. I'm painting in some shadows and adding in some more contrast and depth on the left of the artwork and finishing off the interior of the daisy. Now I can cover the entire right hand side and get the background filled with the charcoal block, and using the sponge I can now smooth out the entire top background. Notice how I use the sheet of glassine to protect myself and the artwork as much as possible. When I can't get into any of the small areas with the sponge, I use a blending stump, and I can now add more dark to the flower to make it appear as if it's receding. I can cover any halos with the paintbrush and soften some of the edges. I'm now completing the entire outlines of this centre daisy and also the third and final daisy in the foreground, also out of focus like the first one I did. To complete the stalk, I just painted it in to create a smoother finish, and I eased off my pressure towards the end. I'm blending graphite to the final flower, and once I've finished with all of the background, it'll be time to refine all of the areas. The charcoal block and the sponge make this really quick. I'm cleaning up my outside edges now using a sharpened pencil, making sure there are no halos and ensuring some nice crisp edges. The background needs another layer to be a bit more smooth, and I can refine the petals. Since this is charcoal, there's often some slight dust, so I'm just bringing my highlights back with the little eraser just to make the lightest lights pop out a bit more. Lots of the time when you're working with charcoal, you're bringing back areas that have been smudged and sharpening things up. So at this point there's a lot of repetition and back and forth. The mono eraser is great for this, but I do have to keep wiping it off. It's important to keep those light areas really light because the center flower is the focal point. Keep brightening up those areas, it'll make a big difference in your final result. When I'm finished comes the best bit, which is to carefully peel off the masking tape. This is a painter's low-tack tape, but still, I go carefully because I don't want to tear the paper. The charcoal drawing is now ready to be stored between some protective sheets or framed. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing if you found this video helpful, and if you want to know when I upload my next videos, just hit the little notification bell, and I'll see you next time.